Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I am the actor.
My name is Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer.
All right, Josh. Here we go.
Finally, is this the first time we've talked about a Stanley Kubrick movie like exclusively in a podcast? I know we talked about Eyes Wide Shut, but it was like part of a conglomeration of movies that we talked about. So I think this might be the first one.
I think you're correct.
Yeah, I know we've brought up things like horror,
right.
The Shining in our horror movies episode, or things like that. But really, as far as like just focusing in on one movie, especially a Stanley Kubrick movie, I think that this is the first one we've done, and it's a bit daunting. I've taken this episode a lot more seriously than I've taken other episodes. Not to say that I haven't taken other episodes seriously, but I feel like for some, like in honor of Stanley Kubrick and all the hard work that he and all the people that he brought together to make this film and any of his films have done, I feel like I need to come with my A game in honor of him and them and everything. But you picked an interesting one to start off with as far as Kubrick movies. Why did you pick A Clockwork Orange?
Okay, I don't know. We have talked about Kubrick, obviously, many times in the past, and we've talked about movies that I would... Yeah. Well, how can you not?
Yeah.
I mean, how can you not? He's amazing. So I've told you a couple of stories about a couple of movies that I've gone to, The Exorcist being one, A Clockwork Orange being another, that I feel like I have seen what I needed to see, absorbed what I needed to absorb, and I don't need to see the movies again. And when it comes to A Clockwork Orange, it was such a disturbing roller coaster ride of emotions that I didn't want to experience that ever again. And it's not so much the violence, it's not so much, it's more the tone of the movie that just makes me nauseous thinking about it. And let me explain that those are all compliments, believe it or not. I don't know how much Kubrick would love hearing that his movie made you feel nauseous, although he might like that. I have a suspension of disbelief that is really deep. And ever since I was a kid, I don't think it's changed since I was 5 years old. When I saw Peter Pan on stage, I believed Peter Pan flew. To this day, I believe that he flew, although it was a she, by the way. And when Tinkerbell dies and you have to bring her back to life, I remember clapping so hard and so loud that I believed I brought her back to life myself. And I was also mad at the kids around me, like, why are you not clapping harder? So to this day, I believe Peter Pan flew and that I single-handedly, no pun intended, brought back Tinkerbell from the brink of death. So my suspension of disbelief is really strong. So when I see a movie, I'm all in. And the visceral experience that I have, depending on the movie, can be daunting. And this is one of those films. I will never see it again, I said. I've experienced it. But I guess because of doing this podcast, and we were searching for something to talk about this week, and I was scrolling through something, looking, and I saw a thumbnail of A Clockwork Orange, and I went, For some reason, it didn't scare me like it instantaneously would have scared me 15 years ago. The poster scares me. And I thought, okay, I've been doing a podcast about movies for about 6.5 years with one of the biggest Kubrick fans in the world. And I am now in middle age, hunkered down in middle age. I'm going to leave it at that. I know I'm a little bit above middle age, but I'm going to stay with middle age. And I thought, well, what would it feel like to experience something that I said at 18 years of age I never wanted to experience again? What would it be like to experience this movie again? And for whatever reason, I just wasn't as afraid as I have been in the past. So I thought, okay, let me suggest this to Josh. Our other alternative was to compare and contrast the new Rebecca to the old Rebecca. And that was a little bit daunting because of two movies and the new one's not coming across as well as everybody says it is. And I love,
so yeah, it's a mess.
Yeah. And I love the original one. So I was like, so when I suggested A Clockwork Orange, I was halfway doing it because I wanted to see how you would react to me suggesting that movie. And you reacted perfectly. You were like, okay, what? Why? And I was like, let's just do it. And then I watched it again and here we are.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's interesting, the themes that you're talking about in your experience with the film, those are mirrored in the film itself. And your nausea with the film, or with even thinking about the film, the iconography in the film, and the way that the film has been portrayed in the media and just in popular culture in general. It imbues this film with some sort of otherworldly aura. But when it comes down to it, it's a movie. This whole movie is about what the moving image and music and all that thing, how that can affect a single person, and how that can affect society in general. And it's also, I mean, it's about so many things. It's about governments, it's about establishment, it's about youth, it's about family, it's about all of these things, and art specifically too. But it does it in such a grubby way and such an unrefined way in certain ways, or at the very least, it juxtaposes something that's unrefined or something that's vulgar with something that is the epitome of refinement or upper crust, being classical music and this type of higher art. So, and that's the first time I'd ever, I mean, I saw this fairly young too, right around 18 years old. And it's the first time I'd ever been confronted with something like that. And I didn't really know much about the iconography and the history of the film. It was just kind of one of those things that just dropped in my lap and was like, you need to see this. And so that was, it was shocking and it was overwhelming. And over the last 20 years since I've seen it the first time, I have watched it every once in a while, and maybe every 5 years or so. And actually, I just rewatched it fairly recently, a couple of years ago, because I was going through all of Kubrick's movies, and then obviously just rewatched it again. And I feel like I got more out of it this time than I've ever gotten out of it, because I already knew all of the basics and I already knew the building blocks. I was able to kind of look past a lot of that stuff, and I found some really cool stuff that I'm excited to share.
I think it's a brilliant movie. I think it is Kubrick at his most interesting, and that's says a lot because he's when is he not really interesting? I think it's well done. It's like Shakespeare for a different society. The language is so specific, and I'm an actor by hobby, so language is important. I don't know if I ever focused on the language before. I never remember having a hard time understanding what
Mm-hmm.
they were talking about, meaning the first I think I've seen the movie twice before this.
Mm.
I can't 100% say that that's true, but I'm pretty sure I saw it originally and I was like, oh. And then I saw a midnight showing in
Wow.
one of my favorite theaters in Norfolk called the Narrow. Yeah, they did that all the time at the
That's
Narrow. The
cool.
Narrow's still really cool. Hopefully it lives past COVID
Yeah.
because it's a definitely really cool theater. And I'm sure it was a midnight show, and I'm sure I was partaking in things that altered my universe. So it might have
Mm.
been some of that, but I don't remember ever having a hang up about understanding what the younger people in this movie, how
Yep.
they talk. This time I was fascinated by it because it's a completely different lingo. And then I realized it's nothing more than, hey, groovy, or keep on trucking, or dig it, or it's lit, any of the stuff that people say. And the scenes that I remember seeing that disturbed me so much, I would have testified to the last ounce of my life that the sequence where he beats up the three other guys and they fall into the little canal
Mm-hmm.
river was shot at night,
Hmm.
and it's not. It's shot during the day. For whatever reason, my mind took it there. Like it had to be as bad as it possibly could be. And that was at night. At the last minute, he attacks them. You don't see it coming. Something about that scene just disturbs me because he's so still before it, and that they don't understand why he's even upset. And the fact that they are anti-establishment and anti-authority and down with the man, but yet he established such a strong authority over his own group was fascinating to me. And the other thing that disturbed me was his mother and father, who I don't remember him having a father, by the way. Um, I thought it was just mum, but apparently it's not. It's mother and father. Their apartment that he lives in, that they live in, the wallpaper makes me nauseous to look at. And I thought it was in the kitchen that the wallpaper was like different types, but it's not. It's in the living room scene later on in the film when he comes back home that you see the one like burgundy red wall, and then you see the silver wallpaper of the kitchen, and you see that wavy kind of blue stuff. It's nauseating. It's just absolutely visually nauseating. And I never really put together what you said at the beginning of the podcast, that makes sense, that it's nauseating because that's what he goes through. I never put that together. So I was not as scared of the film, meaning I'm not scared to watch the movie, but the movie has a frightening element to it. I guess maybe my taste in movies has matured, if you will. And we've talked a lot about movies on this podcast. So maybe my analytical eye is different. So I was absorbing it differently. So yeah, I took everything I could take from it. The interesting thing is that the themes that are there, I got when I was 18 years of age. I understood the themes. I understood the whole idiosyncrasies of being in a gang and what that means in the hierarchy of that. And the idea of actually turning somebody into somebody else because society says that the way that they are is bad. I got that theme. I got the theme of the government is going to outlast just the common man. I got all those themes when I first saw it. So it was more about noticing Kubrick's style, his thumbprint, that I hadn't noticed. He has done a few of those, and I mean this as a compliment, tricks before and after. I mean, there's that shot of in A Clockwork Orange when, and if you haven't seen this movie, it's not anything can really
Well, we haven't
spoil.
even said what it's about yet, so that's a concern.
Yeah.
It's about a British youth in some sort of like future. The movie was made in 1971 and released in 1971, and it's some sort of like future from 1970s England, but it's this kind of like timeless, weird dystopian semi-future where style is a little bit different, but it still seems like timeless somehow. And it's about a young man who's the leader of a gang. He ends up getting in trouble with the law and then goes through this revolutionary technique of re-education of the brain, and then the movie kind of goes on from there. It's supposed to get him to, instead of him just languishing in prison, it's supposed to get him out of prison and get him to be revolted by violence and, you know, rape and all of these things, so that he won't ever do that once he reintroduces himself to society. But then the film kind of moves on from there, which we start getting into spoiler territory at that point. But I think most people, like we've talked about, have seen certain images from this film, even though they haven't seen the film. But I think that there's a lot more to it. It's definitely an adult movie. Like, it is super adult. Like, I mean, you can't. There's no reason for a child to see this film. And I think even like being 18, there were things that I wasn't able to pick up, especially the governmental stuff. I just wasn't able to I wasn't, engaged in a political sense or anything like that. So a lot of that stuff kind of like, flew over my head as far as like totalitarianism and the threats that the writer was talking about. I kind of, that flew over my head. But just the sheer, just I don't know. It seems like it would really like screw somebody up if they experience this film without a kind of a frame, mind frame of this being a critique of certain things, as opposed to what's the word, bolstering or celebrating, a celebration of violence. It's definitely not a celebration of violence. And in fact, the violence that you see on screen isn't as impactful as when he cuts away from violence. So there are certain things that you do see, but it's like the threat of violence, and especially early on in the film, there's a home invasion. Just the fact that we get to, and we're kind of jumping ahead, but so anyway, that's the plot. But just the fact that we get to see how, a family, a couple, tranquil inside their house, and then on a dime it changes. Like, that is so much scarier than seeing an actual rape scene, which, I mean, there are rape scenes in the film, but that to me is more impactful than just a body sex based scene. So
Agreed. Well, you know what I was thinking when you were talking? Yeah, if a person was to take this as a command to be violent, they would have taken that command from anything.
That's
This
true.
is like American Psycho 1971. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
not, American Psycho is more satirical in its take on the subject matter, but once again, I find it interesting that Kubrick has been slammed around for this film in particular in his ultra violence habits. When we just watched Braveheart last night, which I think is a brilliant film, my father and I taped it and we're going through a list of things that we're watching, and Braveheart was next, and that is uber violent. And Mel Gibson is extremely violent in his films. Talk about love of gore. I think that it takes the right person to be influenced by a film like A Clockwork Orange to do the wrong thing. You know what I mean? Like, I think you're set up already if this movie triggers something in
Yeah.
you. And if it triggers something, and you're right, anybody under the age of 18 or not mature enough or educated enough, not meaning books smart education, but just in the world. You know,
Yeah.
I know an 18-year-old who is smarter when it comes to the ways of relationships than I've ever been.
Mm.
And I'm like asking him for advice, and he just turned 18. He's super smart about things when it comes to that. So it takes the right 18-year-old to understand a film like this. I was surrounded by theater people and creative people and music people and all of these people. And I had a English teacher whose son was one of my friends. And so I had a cushion around me to go, what? When I came out of it shaking, like, what the hell was that? And then, you know, maybe that's why I got all the themes, because maybe they were explained to me. Also, aversion therapy is a solid therapeutic technique. And I don't want anybody ever thinking, because we're talking about this movie, that aversion therapy is not something that I think is bad. I don't necessarily think it's great for stuff like this, but aversion therapy does work for some things.
As far as like smoking cessation or something?
Yeah, quitting smoking and biting your nails and stuff like that. Stuff that's not rape and murder. I didn't realize, I guess maybe I've never really ventured into, like you did, watching Kubrick film after Kubrick film after Kubrick film, but I had taped Eyes Wide Shut. I had taped Doctor Strangelove, and now I just recently saw A Clockwork Orange again. Oh, and we also saw The Shining over Halloween, my father and I. And there are similar shots in all of those movies that are in A Clockwork Orange. And I find that interesting because for whatever reason, every Kubrick film seems just its own entity in amongst itself. And there's nothing like it. There's nothing in any other movie like it. But that's not true, because since you mentioned the couple who got broken into in A Clockwork Orange, he shows up later, Alex, the main guy, the protagonist, for lack of a better term. He shows up looking for help from home, which I think is crazy that their house is called home. It's like, good food, mom, generic food. And there's a big lit up sign outside that says home. I love that. And then he talks about that in that speech on his way to that. That was just brilliant. When he shows back up, he, not very smart kid, because he sings the same song, which triggers the owner of the house to have a flashback of what happened. And he realizes this is the guy who created or committed this heinous crime, which ultimately his wife killed herself over, and he is paralyzed because of. And you have that shot of him doing that shaking thing the same way Danny shakes in The Shining. And I thought, oh, wow. I don't know if I've ever noticed that, but I think Kubrick's used that shot a couple of times. And it's this very interesting shot because it's not a dead on up close shot. It's kind of down below in front
Just
of them.
like The Shining.
And and it's unnerving. Not only the situation that you got going on in both those two movies, but it's that actual angle makes it even that much more unnerving. So I think that's what has made me afraid of this film for such a long time. And that's a high holy compliment. If I've got enough out of a film and I can never experience it again, I think that that's really something. But I would have never noticed the patterns if I didn't get a chance to venture back into this movie. So it was a good thing.
So we're definitely starting to get into some plot points, but I did kind of want to touch on some big themes and big things that Kubrick uses in this film to his advantage. But before I go through that, I kind of want to talk about just how it got to be in front of a camera. So Kubrick got this book given to him by Terry Southern, who helped him write Doctor Strangelove. And when he read it, it's a book by Anthony Burgess, which he's got an interesting kind of backstory. Anthony Burgess he's a writer, a novelist, and he was told that he had like a year to live, and he wrote like 5 separate books like very quickly. He had some sort of inoperable brain tumor, I guess. But it turns out he lived longer than what they told him. But within that year, or at least a little bit before that, his wife had been a victim of like a vicious gang rape. And so he took that and put that into A Clockwork Orange and shoved that in there with his own version of this NADSAT is what he called it, language. And I've read the book, and in the book, there's a glossary so that you can kind of reference, oh, this is what this means. This is what this means. Yarbles means balls, that kind of a thing. So you're able to kind of go through and determine what that means. But what Kubrick didn't have the capability of doing is a glossary. Now, he could have come up with something like subtitles or something that translated it. But instead of doing that, he found out better ways to do it. He found out visual context to give so that the audience knows inherently, like you said, you never struggled with knowing what they were talking about. And even if it was a word or a group of words that didn't necessarily fit immediately, you were able to, through context clues, understand exactly what they were talking about, whether it's a different word for head, or whether it's a different word for stomach, or whether it's a different word for going out and having fun or sex or whatever. You're able to get it.
He doesn't dumb it down. And I think that just like good Shakespeare, when it's done well, you understand what the context of the sentence is by however the actor plays it, and or however the director presents it. You understand what those things are.
And I've also noticed that even when they're speaking, he does speak in kind of like a, what do you call it?
Iambic pentameter?
Maybe that, but it's like the Queen's English, or that kind of like higher.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like a higher level of word use that is a formalism that is associated not necessarily with people who have jobs at a pub or something. They kind of like move between those things, and he uses those depending on who he speaks with. Alex DeLarge, the main character, will use some of that higher level speech even when he's talking to the bum at the very beginning, when he's kind of like poking and prodding on the bum. It's all about juxtapositions, and it's all about tone. I mean, we've talked about how Kubrick is a master of tone. And I think that he read this book and he saw something that he thought that he was going to be able to imbue, like a sense of this weird dichotomy of formalism, but just complete hedonism. So that's the stuff that, I mean, that was the thing that stood out to me even the first time that I watched it. But the more and more I've seen it, it's amazing how he's able to kind of like balance those scales always, constantly, whether it's horror versus humor. I mean, he kind of goes back and forth between those constantly throughout this film. He saw this book and he was like, okay, I think I can do this. And he's also coming off of, not only in 1968, he made 2001, which was a decent success for MGM, and it won an Academy Award. And he also had a pretty big budget for it. He had $12 million to make it. And he was ready to cash in his Hollywood chips. I'm successful with 2001. Now everybody is asking me what I want to make. I want to make Napoleon. And so he spent all this time, all this energy, all this money preparing to make Napoleon. And it turned out that he couldn't get the funding for various reasons. He just couldn't get the funding. And so he went into this, I don't know what I'm going to do next thing, and started developing different stuff. And he found that with The Clockwork Orange, it was something he felt he could do quickly, and also that he felt that he could do on a lower budget. So the budget for this film was $2 million. So it was 1/6 of the budget of 2001. So it's essentially a low budget film for Stanley Kubrick specifically. But in general, as far as like Hollywood movies, or Warner Brothers distributed it, and this is the first time he worked with Warner Brothers, this was not a big risk for them. It was Stanley Kubrick making a movie for them, and all they had to do was give him $2 million. So they shot a lot on location, things like that, to reduce the price. But I think that also maybe freed him up a little bit. I don't know, but maybe freed him up to experiment a little bit more. I don't remember him using zooms as much as he did until this movie. Did he use zooms a lot in 2001? I can't remember. I just can't remember if he used it. But I mean, like, he obviously uses them a lot in Barry Lyndon, a lot in The Shining, And well, he actually uses them a lot in some of the battle scenes in Full Metal Jacket. So all of those movies, like it's pretty much like from here on, he's like Zoom City. But I don't know about before now if he used zooms. Can you remember any in like 2001 or Lolita or
And Spartacus
Doctor
and
Strangelove
Paths
has
of
a
Glory.
few.
Yeah, they all seem straightforward telling stories. So I'd have to actually, those kind of things don't stick out to
Mm-hmm.
me until they stick out to me. Yeah, as soon as you said that, I was like, wait, they're in The Shining. That's definite. They're in, I think they're even in Eyes Wide Shut. But it's not like this.
Just the first shot of the film is a close up on his face with him looking at the camera. And then you zoom out.
Real
Yeah.
quick, it's about 25, 30 seconds of zooming out of Malcolm McDowell's face,
Really?
and he does not blink the whole entire time. And I rewound it and counted down, and he does not blink. I thought when you finally get far enough away from him that he blinks, he does not.
Wow. You mix the zoom with the wide angle lenses and you get a lot of unnatural, it's not humanly natural motion. Like a dolly shot, a human looks like
Right.
that. Or
Yeah.
even handheld camera. A human can experience that in the same way that the camera is moving, but a zoom is not natural. And wide angle lenses are not natural. Like extreme wide angle lenses are not natural. So inherently, the filmmaker is telling the audience, this is something that you need to pay attention to because it's taking you out of realism. It's doing something that only films can do. He utilizes both of those. And on top of that, he's able to utilize narration too.
And actually, the narrator doesn't really narrate the story, really. He just kind of comments here and there. He doesn't really tell you any, it's not exposition. It's not like he says, okay, and then we went to this because of this. It's just factually what's happening or how he feels about something.
It's how he feels.
And that's unusual too. Yeah, it's unusual. Yeah. That's not what a narrator does. They narrate the story. So that's great.
Yeah, it's definitely not a Sam Spade type narrator. But what it does is it makes us complicit, and we've talked about this before with narration, but it makes us complicit in his actions. Because now all of a sudden, like he's calling us his brothers. He says my brother a lot. And so we are not only complicit in what he's doing just by the fact that we're watching the film to a certain extent, but also in that you feel like you're rooting for him in certain situations. He's in almost every shot of the film. So, you know, we're with him through this journey the whole time. And so it gives you a conflicting standpoint because he's doing wrong things, but you're also rooting for him. And so it puts the audience in a tough position, but that's purposeful. And it's very similar to, we've talked about American Psycho in the past. It's very similar to what Bret Easton Ellis does in that book and what Mary Harron does in her film, where you're brought into the mental space of this person who has no regard for other people. And in fact, this movie, I think, is a little bit more nuanced than American Psycho as far as the main character is concerned. But those are, I think, the tool belt that, you know, the bat belt that he has that Kubrick's working with, on top of set design, costume design, all of those things. The bowler hats, I didn't really understand. Like, I just thought bowler hats were, like, the only two times I remember bowler hats is Mary Poppins, the dad banker in Mary Poppins, and A Clockwork Orange. That's the only two times I've ever really seen bowler hats. And
that about sums you up so perfectly. I don't know what does. Mary Poppins and A Clockwork Orange. Whenever anybody asks me about your taste in movies, that's what I'm going to tell them.
So, but it turns out like that was a purposeful choice because bankers were like in the 20th century, bankers were known for wearing these types of like bowler hats, you know, kind of the more refined type guy. So, you know, the costume designer was kind of like, you know, if you put a bowler hat on your main character, like you're saying something. You're saying that he's kind of co-opting that symbol and using that as a piece of costume and representing something wholly different. The other gang that they fight has a lot of Nazi iconography, the eagles, and then I think there's some swastikas that they're wearing too, but and they're more like of a military than the high boots and all that stuff. They're more of like a military group. I guess that's their theme or whatever. Their uniform is Nazi based, and then the Droogs are more, I don't know what those like white bodysuits with the cod pieces are. Maybe fencing. I don't know. But anyway, that there's a definite style to each of these groups, and it's an identifier too. That's like, oh, you're not part of my group. You're part of that group. So I found that interesting too. But all of those things put together, and then on top of all of that, we get this classical music. It's very famous pieces of music. And in a lot of cases, the first time that I'd ever heard them, the Thieving Magpie, that is the song that plays pretty much in its entirety, or at least the movement that plays almost in its entirety, which starts once again on a zoom out of a proscenium and a stage where this rival group is starting to rape this woman. And then the Droogs come in and they end up fighting. But that Thieving Magpie theme by Rossini is the first time I think I'd ever heard that was this movie. And so now every time I hear that piece of music, I think of this movie, which is, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's other people out there who don't think like that, but for me, it's like, it's not necessarily ruined, quote unquote, for me, but it's definitely made a mark on how I experienced that piece of art. Similarly, Singing in the Rain, actually. I had never seen Singing in the Rain before I saw this movie. So that was a little weird, but I was able to get through it. I mean, like, I like Singing in the Rain as a movie. So I somehow am able to like separate those two things. It doesn't help that Kubrick decides to play Gene Kelly's version of Singing in the Rain at the end of this film, but I think that was kind of like a twist of the knife, maybe.
Yeah.
But
I loved it. I love it. Well, it took forever for him to solidify the rights to
oh
that
yeah,
because I think that was, don't quote me on this, but I think Malcolm McDowell came up with that day
he
on the
did.
set,
Yeah,
and he was like, okay, that's cool, you can do it, but I doubt we'll be able to keep it in the film because we won't get the rights to that. And they tried and they tried and they tried, and eventually they
yeah. I
did.
listened to an interview not with Kubrick but with his one of his production managers, and when it was happening, the production manager came up to him and said like, "Hey, Stanley, we can't do this because of the music rights." And Stanley said, "Just get it done," because they had spent so much time. They spent all this time. I think they said 4 days on this scene, and they hadn't barely shot any. I don't even know if they shot any film the first 2 or 3 days because they were choreographing and then trying to make it work and trying to figure out how they were going, who was going to move where and how long it was going to take, and it wasn't working. The key is that Stanley Kubrick said, "Can you dance?" And because this is a Malcolm McDowell, I listened to an interview with him. He's done a bunch of interviews about this film, but Kubrick said, "Can you dance?" And McDowell said, "Sure, yeah, I'm singing in the rain," and he started, he had a cane on him, and I think that was probably the key, that he had already had a cane, so he, kind of like substituted the cane for the umbrella, and then started doing the singing in the rain bit. And that's when Kubrick was like, okay, do that. That's it. Like, that's the key. So it wasn't necessarily like just Malcolm McDowell or just Stanley Kubrick. It was, number one, Kubrick being open to other people's input, and which a lot of people think that he's like some dictator, but it didn't seem like he was a dictator. It seemed like he was very open to anyone's input and didn't really care who came up with the idea if it was a good idea, especially if it was a better idea than his. The Singing in the Rain thing was a better idea than anything he'd come up with for 3 days. And then they unlock that puzzle piece and they're able to make it happen. And that's the other thing that Malcolm McDowell said, is they didn't necessarily like do a bunch of takes. There were certain scenes where they did a bunch of takes, but there were some scenes where they got it in 2 or 3 takes. But what he did say in the interviews that I heard is that there was number one, a lot of lighting. They spent a lot of time on lighting. And number two, they spent a lot of time on rehearsal before rolling. And I guess if you want to compare that to a David Fincher, now film is essentially free because David Fincher shoots digital. So why wouldn't you shoot rehearsals and do a bunch of takes, because there's really no difference between turning the cameras on and having the cameras off. Whereas you're literally like burning money every time you are rolling on a camera when you're using film. So I understand that, but all of these things come together to say that like Kubrick wasn't some sort of like megalomaniacal, you do it my way or you get out type of a person, especially during filming. I think maybe he was more like that in the editing room, but whatever.
I don't understand that. It's that's his
Yeah.
job. That's his job. And I've never heard that about Stanley Kubrick. I've always heard he's collaborative, and Tom Cruise talks about that. I've heard Malcolm McDowell talk about that. I've heard a lot of people who've worked with him. Matthew
Mm.
Modine talked about that. So no, actually, he's the opposite. He doesn't like it when you're feeling inhibited to try something and you don't want to do it because you're on a Stanley Kubrick film. He's like, let's try it. And I mean, when he films later on in his life and he does 68 takes, what do you care whether or not Tom Cruise's idea is 58th? Who cares? I mean, shoot it. It's not a big deal. And he actually, I think it was that documentary you
Life
gave
in
me to
Pictures. Yeah.
watch where he talks about, yeah, where he talks about if an actor brings up an idea, we go ahead and try it because one for them, one for me.
Mm.
And so if I allow them to be free enough to do what they want, then they are free enough to do what I want them to do. So that makes sense to me. And nowadays you're absolutely right. Why not do something like that? Back to Singing in the Rain. I don't know what's worse. Knowing the song and knowing that movie and knowing the history or your history with that song, meaning it being part of the lexicon of your upbringing as a
Mm.
child, like it was mine, and then seeing that scene or not knowing it at all, and then forever it being tainted, if you will, by that scene. I actually think it's worse knowing the song first.
I think you're
I
right.
can I don't there's nothing I can compare. I don't know. There's nothing I can compare it to, but there isn't even a word. Disturbing doesn't do it. When he starts singing that song, it's just going to be bad. And another thing about seeing it again after all this time, for whatever reason, those scenes I thought were spread out during the whole movie. They're in the first half an hour, 45 minutes of the movie. All of the
Yeah.
scenes are in the beginning. The rest of the movie is a version therapy movie, if you will. And then the last third is about actually what happens when he comes out of all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a very quick third part of the film. I actually think the middle part of the film, now that I've seen it a second time, there's some criticism about the second act of this film that it's prolonged, it takes too long, it repeats itself over and over again. And I've read that before, so maybe that's somewhere in my brain.
Mm.
But I did feel like there are parts of that they repeated themselves over and over and over again. You get the
Really,
point.
the prison scene moves
You-
pretty quickly to
oh,
me. Like once so like he spends more time, Kubrick spends more time on the bureaucracy of checking in to the prison than he does his whole time in the prison. I think that says a lot about Kubrick's view on bureaucracy, Kubrick's view on the state, and Kubrick's view on control, and how British society, I guess, in this film, has decided to take control over this youth and put him away. And then I think that's the key, because the whole like stand behind the line, don't drop it, pick it up and put it down properly. This like formalism. And and it's hilarious. The whole scene is hilarious.
it's the way that actor does it.
Yes. He's so
When he
pent
starts
up.
to speak,
Yeah, he's so pent up. I even noticed this time, like the way that his mustache is even cut. Like it's cut so like severely. I don't know. I've never seen a mustache like that before. But just all about him. The other thing that I noticed is this time was that when he's checking him in, he's checking in all the stuff and all this, and then he goes over, and as he checks into the prison, he's like stripping down naked. And right at the moment that he strips naked, the inspector that's asking him all this stuff, he says, "Are you or have you ever been at any time a homosexual?" And he's looking at his crotch. And I was like, "What?
Yeah. Oh
What
yeah.
the heck?"
Oh yeah. I noticed that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
obviously some
Yeah.
pent
That was
up
great.
something going on with this guy. But yeah,
Yeah. That's great, because but what's great about that is that you now know that Kubrick is not making it about a homophobic reference. He's making a statement about the contradiction and the lies that people keep up with their own self. That it has been said in that guy's tone that it is a bad thing to be a homosexual. It has a tone of that's a sin and that's against nature and all that other stuff. But Kubrick instinctually or consciously or unconsciously knows better because he's not making a statement about being gay. He's making a statement about how we make it bad to be gay, even though he strips down naked and is looking at his crotch the whole entire time he's waiting for his response. Yeah, I did notice that. I
Yeah.
laughed out loud. That is just great. And then turns around and has to bend the guy over and look behind him with a pin
To make
light.
sure he's not bringing anything in or something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
But, let's look at a person's crotch and then let's examine somebody's behind and let's make homosexuality a bad thing, even though I'm doing all of these things that says that, maybe I think it's a good thing. What I thought of is I'm wondering about how many takes they did on that scene, because I have been in situations where it's been a little uncomfortable, but never like that. I've done stuff on stage that could be uncomfortable and has been a little uncomfortable to rehearse, only because you just don't do those things in front of other people normally. So it's like, what's happening here? And then to technically break it down, it becomes like a dance, which is really weird because I've learned dances for plays too. So it's the exact same thing, but you're touching and doing things that are not part of dancing normally. So I wondered to myself, how many takes did they do on that one? Like, how many, did Malcolm McDowell go, wait a second, I've got to go take another shower? Like, what was the technical breakdown of something? I mean, because, you think about it, there's a lot of strange things that happen when you're in those positions. So I thought to myself, that was interesting, but it's handled extremely well. Yeah. When you were talking about when he comes into the prison and the regiment of all of that and how he's taught, and Kubrick is making a statement about the system and about the man and all that other stuff. I can't think of a better term than the man. But I actually thought something different while watching those scenes. Yes, that guy's an exaggerated character and he is probably taking his job a little too seriously. He's in the wrong movie. He should be in Full Metal Jacket. So you get all of that disenfranchised youth and how adults don't treat them the way they should be treated and misunderstood and all that other stuff. But at the same time, there is an ounce for me of, if Alex had had more of this influence early on, maybe, that he would not be a sociopath running around doing anything he wants to do in the middle of the night, raping people and murdering people and so forth and so on. So there is this fine line for me about following the rules and bucking the rules. I believe that obviously there are rules in society you have to follow. You have to stop at the red octagon. You just do, because it's a stop sign. And if you don't, you'll hurt somebody. So there are rules and regulations that affect our society that are good. I think when an authority figure takes those rules and regulations and abuses those is when it becomes dangerous, and they're as dangerous as this disenfranchised youth is. So when he goes, stand on the white line, the way that guy talks is amazing. One day I'm going to learn how to imitate him, because it's just going to come out one day. I know it, because he affected me this time. He is so funny. But when he talks about standing on the line and then how ridiculous the gap is between the person and the line and actually signing the book or actually giving over your items, it's farcical.
Yeah. It's the inefficiency of government
at the same time. Right. But at the same time, if Alex learned to stay on the line a little bit earlier on in his youth, would he have done what he has done? So it's just something I thought I'd throw out there, because I don't think that Kubrick's message, at least not for me, is that authority is bad. Maybe authoritarianism is bad, but not all people who have authority over our lives are bad. And I think that maybe when you're 16, 17, 18, and you see A Clockwork Orange and you read Catcher in the Rye, maybe that's the mindset that you're in. But at the same time, I think that rules need to be respected.
Well,
anyway, I mean, maybe that's the middle age of me saying that, but I'm just saying that I think it's...
I think there's a couple things there. Number one, if you do read A Clockwork Orange, especially the British version of A Clockwork Orange, there's a whole extra chapter at the end of the book where he ends up kind of like of his own volition, realizing that he's not going to be able to sustain a life of ultraviolence. And then he's not really contributing to society, and he wants to have something more in his life. And so he moves on, essentially mentally. He moves on from his need and desire to just ruin people's lives wholesale. And so there's more of a moral ending to the book, meaning that he went through something as an adolescent and as a young adult and was wrung through the system and came out the other side, and determined that even though all of these bad things that happened to him, even though he did all these bad things of his own volition, and number two, all these things bad things happened to him because of what the government did to him, he still felt like he was going to be able to contribute to society. And I think you're right. I don't think Kubrick's trying to say that any kind of rules are bad, or that society is bad, but a perversion of the rules, or an overtaking of someone's free will and someone's liberty, really, by forcing them into a particular thought pattern. That's the scary part. That's one of the horrors of this film, and also of Burgess's novella. But these are nuanced conversations, and so you can't just like slap something against the wall and spend 30 seconds talking about it and be like, oh, okay, well, Kubrick likes raping and looting and beating people. It's not that. So he's hoping that people can actually come to the film and be willing to spend the time and energy to analyze the things that he's putting in front of you. And he puts so many small things in front of you that, you won't even notice. And some of them are jokes. I mean, they're just like straight up jokes. Like when Alex is at the stereo store and he's looking for a record and ends up finding two women. While you get in between him and the two women on the shot that he comes in on, you see in the record racks, you see 2001, actually a compilation album, but it's 2001, A Space Odyssey record. And it's subtle. It is center of frame, but it's low, and you're probably looking at him and the girls and him looking at the girls. But I've seen it enough and I've heard about it enough that you can definitely clock it. But that's obviously, so now it's a future world where 2001 A Space Odyssey was actually a movie and Kubrick was in this world of A Clockwork Orange. I mean, like, is that a thing, or is that just kind of like a joke? I don't know. Another kind of joke in there too references Dr. Strangelove, where the actual serum that is injected into him is serum 114, and he even zooms in, like he starts out like on kind of like a medium shot of the tray, and he zooms into the vial and it says serum 114. Well, the decoder device that is inside every bomber in Dr. Strangelove is CRM 114. And so it's like, come on, guys, he's kind of like making jokes, and it means nothing, but it's just funny. I mean, I think that it's really cool that he's able to have fun with it. And those are definitely like super in jokes, but there's all kinds of things like that are peppered in there. We haven't talked about Beethoven yet, or about Wendy Carlos. Beethoven is used throughout this film, whether it's Ode to Joy or even the doorbell of the writer's house is the Fifth Symphony. So the ba 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 bum, that's their doorbell. Which, I mean, dang, that's kind of a deep cut as far as like, because first time I heard it, because you hear it multiple times in the film. First time I heard it this time, I was like, oh yeah, I totally forgot that, but thought that was pretty cool. And then Wendy Carlos, I'm sure since you said you just saw The Shining, you've gotten a pretty big dose of Wendy Carlos over the last few weeks, I guess, because she did the synthesizer work for this film, and she also did the synthesizer stuff on The Shining. And that's stuff that like you can't ever get out of your head, for me at least, the way that music is played. Because I mean, these are pieces of music that have been that she's adapting and that she's performing on synthesizer, but they'd never really been done before. And synthesizers were fairly new. It was like, I guess they're called Moog synthesizers, or what she was using back then. You spend like 2 seconds hearing it and you're like, oh, that's from Clockwork Orange. Just the fact that like Kubrick was like, I know I need something. I don't know what I need, but I need something. And she was able to make that happen.
The thing about that for me is that what reminds you of something can be a smell or a color or a taste or a sound, but it can bring you right back to certain times in your life. And I am riding out the first 15 or 20 minutes of this movie kind of in denial that I'm watching it. so I can be secure for the fact that if I can't do it, then I'm going to call you and say, okay, I'm sorry, it's the last minute, but we can't do the podcast on this because I can't get through this film again because I'm scared. I was good with everything, the colors, the sci-fi futuristic 60s thing that they were doing on. It must be in the future because everybody has purple hair. So that's definitely futuristic. But, the milk bar is
Mm.
unnerving. All the scenes in the beginning are unnerving, but it's the music and in particular those synthesized sounds that brought me right back to seeing the film the first time I saw it. I thought, man, oh man, I'm glad I'm not listening to this on headsets because I would duck out. Um, but I'm also a child of the 80s, so the whole Tangerine Dream thing and the whole synthesizer thing is part of my upbringing. And so you would think it would flatten it out a little bit, meaning it would be just par for the course for me. But there is something unnerving about what she does with just one note. And it's been done a million times before, just one note. But the one note that she chooses, especially in The Shining, is horrifying. It's like, stop.
Mm.
Even my father was like, can we turn that down? I was like, what's the matter? He's like, that note, it can't, something bad in this note. And I was like, yeah, terrible. And she does something very similar in A Clockwork Orange, except for it's 3 or 4
Yeah.
notes. And it's continuous and it's really unnerving. I don't think she was nominated for the
Mm.
Oscar. I know the movie was nominated for Best Picture, and it was nominated for 4 Oscars. I
Mm.
think it was Best Picture, Best Director, I think
Screenplay
cinematography, and I
and
think
and
production.
film editing.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there you go. Which all makes sense.
Yeah.
And maybe people didn't understand. Well, I'm sure people in the industry might have understood, but maybe people weren't taking those kind of things seriously.
Yeah.
Maybe they weren't looking at that as a soundtrack or an orchestration of a sound or
A score.
music from a
Yeah.
movie. Maybe that's not what. Yeah, score. Thank you. I couldn't think of that word. Maybe people weren't thinking that way, which is unfortunate because was the score for Jaws nominated for best original
Hmm.
score? Because it should have been.
Yeah.
And so, one note or 25 notes. So yeah, the music is interesting. And also, I do want to say one thing about his love of Beethoven. It's a little bit confusing because at the age of what's he 15 to 17 in the novel and he's 17 to 19 in the movie, I think
Mm-hmm.
is what they changed it to him being legal age in Britain just because
It's
it's even
easier.
creepier that he's 15. Yeah, it's easier, right? Especially full frontal nudity and so forth and so on. Although I guess that depends on the actor, not the age they're saying the actor is. But anyway, people, and maybe this is my concept of music enlightens people and lifts their consciousness up from where it might have been. So I'm destroying my own argument as it's coming out of my mouth because my discussion is that somebody who's that intellectual to know Beethoven, would he not be intellectually smart enough to know he's a sociopath and that what he's doing is wrong? But there are plenty of characters and plenty of movies and plenty of books and plenty of plays that have high quality taste in stuff and are still criminals. So I just blew my own
Mm.
theory. Something about it just twinged me the wrong way the first time, this time that I saw the
Yeah,
movie.
I think that the big thing to take away probably from the his relationship with Beethoven is that Beethoven is manifesting in music what he feels when he's doing the things that he's doing. When he's beating somebody up, or that's a representation of what he feels, because when we hear him put in that little mini cassette, which is so super awesome, like his turntable was amazing. He had this amazing turntable, didn't even use it. He had these little like mini cassettes, which I mean, we're around for, I don't know, like a couple of years probably. But back in 1971, they were probably like super expensive and super fancy, and that was probably one of the like quote unquote futuristic things. It's like, oh, 20 years from now,
I know. I
everybody's,
was gonna say it's the
yeah,
future. Yeah,
everybody's gonna be
it's the future.
listening to
Yeah,
these little tapes, and it's like, oh, geez, okay, thanks, guys. But yeah, so when he's listening to that after that whole night of just crazed, like you said, psychopathy, he it was is dreaming or thinking in his mind of all these things, all these other things that he wants to do, or thinking of things that he was doing, because like you said, it takes him back. It's a way for him to emotionally connect, I guess. But he's getting something totally different out of it than somebody else, than some rich guy sitting at a symphony would. But it's that relationship between art and, how art affects a person, and that art can affect a person even physically. That was what I got from the relationship with Beethoven specifically. And it's also setting him up for the Ludovico technique and the Beethoven. When Ode to Joy gets played during the Ludovico technique, then we understand how that affects him. So we haven't really talked about the Ludovico technique very much, but once he gets into that hospital and has the eyedroppers and all that stuff, and I did want to ask you about, like, as an actor, if you were put in that situation. It sounded like Malcolm McDowell was game, but like they did that for I don't know how long, like days maybe, and he ended up like scratching a cornea, and seemed like guerrilla filmmaking or something. But just getting those things strapped onto his eyes and having somebody drop her saline into his eyes, like I couldn't imagine going through that. At what point would you kind of be like, okay, I'm out, let's figure out a different way to do this?
Um, I don't know. I'm pretty games for things like that. It kind of empowers me
Mm,
that I'm going to do things that I might not do in real life and I might never have a chance to do in real life, and that to see whether or not I have the endurance to put up with something like that. That's what I was thinking about this time. The first time I saw the movie, I was like, "Oh my god, this is horrific," because they actually
yeah,
do that. You can see they're
you
attaching
can't
it.
fake
There's
it.
no CGI. There's no nothing. And I'm not surprised he scratched a cornea. I'm actually not surprised it went a lot worse than it actually did. The thing that would get me is the control part of it. I am not in control of my own tears.
Mm,
I am not in control of wetting my eyes when my eyes need liquid. That would bother me probably more than anything. But I remember having to do, I think, in a costume construction class or makeup class in college where we had to do a mold of our face. And of course, you do like a layer of Vaseline and then a layer of plastic and then a layer of all this other stuff. And then the actual latex stuff gets poured over your face and you just have your nostrils to breathe out of. And I mean, they get covered up sometimes and you can't see and you can't speak out and you can't do anything. All you can think to yourself is if you freak out, you're going to ruin your mold. And something opposite happened to me. It empowered me to get through that. I just kind of like went into a Zen place and decided I'm not going to die in Richmond, Virginia at VCU from getting a mold put on my face. That's not how I'm supposed to die. I mean, I might be traumatized for a little bit, but it's no different than like not being able to swim and learning how to swim and getting water in your nose. You deal with it, you figure it out, you try not to do it again. And I got through it. As a matter of fact, I made suggestions later on that we cut off straws and we put straws in people's nose. Sometimes that worked for people, sometimes that didn't work for people. Um, it made it better for some people, but you just kind of power through it. So I can't imagine it because I don't know how many days they filmed that scene. And I can't imagine the idea of it, being told it and reading about it either in the novel or in the script and trying to get a grasp of what, because they had to have come to him and said, here's what this is going to look like, just like they had to try a certain cod piece on him, a certain bowler hat on him. That's what the costume designer does. The idea that these clamps are going to be on my actual eyes, and I'm sure they described them to him, that would have been more frightening than actually trying it. And then the other thing that happens when there's a practical prop like that, it makes you live in that moment. They say you should always try your shoes on. And if you have any form of a costume at the beginning of rehearsal, to plead and beg, depending on who you're working with, to wear those things. In particular, the
mm,
shoes, because certain shoes make you walk a certain way. And once you find that walk, you usually find the character. I had a Bible in the last play that I was in, and I clung onto that Bible like I was a 10-year-old Catholic again. And there's something about that Bible, like I didn't want people touching my Bible.
mm.
And it wasn't like I cared about my prop. Now, I do care about people touching other people's props because that can mess you up. You go to grab your Bible and it's not there.
Yeah, it was your Bible. There were many like that one, but that one was yours.
Correct.
So I'm now going to take this time to trot out a theory that I have developed through this last time of watching the film. And, we've talked about it, we've kind of talked around it, but I think the movie is Kubrick exploring duality of man. And really, a lot of his movies are exploring the duality of man, like a human's capacity for good and evil. And this movie is a very specific exploration of that. It's saying like, how evil can a person be, and still what kind of redeeming qualities could they hold after doing all of these horrible things. And I just saw this time, which I want to get your opinion on this too, because I have not found a hole in it yet, but I think that Kubrick used the structure of this film as a mirror. So the center of this film is the Ludovico technique. But if you look at the very beginning of the movie and the very end of the movie, and you work your way towards the center, there are mirrored events throughout the film. So he starts off at the film like with his droogs at the milk bar, and he actually ends the film with his new droogs. In fact, he even says at the end, when all the governmental people come in, he says, hi, 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 my droogies. Like, he says that. So as you move through the film, they go from the milk bar to the gang rape and brawl and into the home invasion. Now, obviously, you have the home invasion at the beginning of the film. You also have closer to the end of the film, he goes back to that home. He enacts violence on that man and his wife ends up dying because of it. And at the end of the film, or closer to the end of the film, violence is enacted on him. Now it's emotional violence. It's playing Beethoven's Ninth, but it makes him jump out of the window. So there's a mirror to that scene. And as you move closer to the center of the film, the next scene that I remember that matches up is like the Thames slow-mo scene with him and his droogs, where he beats them up. Like, he feels threatened that they're going to overtake him as the leader. And so he beats them up. It's that amazing slow motion scene as they're walking along the water, and he beats them up and throws them into the water. So he enacts violence on them, throws them into the water. At the end of the film, they're now police officers. They beat him up and put him in the water. And then we keep getting closer. Oh, the bums. He beats up a bum at the very beginning, and that same bum ends up like getting his other bum buddies, and they beat him up. And so they all kind of they all kind of like work towards, I mean, anything that happens at the beginning of the film up to Ludovico is mirrored at the end of the film and in succession at the end of the film. His parents, he has one scene with his parents in the morning where he talks to them and, you know, what's going on. And then at the end, he comes home and his parents have a surrogate son now that they like more than him. He's kind of enacting violence on them in an emotional state, and they're enacting violence on him emotionally by replacing him. There's all kinds of these parallels that I didn't even really see until watching the movie this time. And actually, I paused the movie right as he was getting admitted to the hospital for the Ludovico technique. And it was an hour and 8 minutes into the film, and there was an hour and 8 minutes left in the film at that moment when he gets checked into there. The reason why I paused it is because another one of these like funny things that I noticed this time, and also because you can pause it. Like, if you're in a movie theater, you can't really pause it. But since I was watching it at home, I could pause it. There's a big sign in the back behind the entrance, the kind of like question area where he gets signed over from the police to the hospital. And the sign is just got arrows everywhere, this way to this thing, this way to this thing. And I just started reading through some of them. Like, I don't know what this place is, but it has a physics department, an establishment administration, a treasurer's department, a chief engineer, a catering department, a Q block, and a cinema. Like, it's got all of those things in that one building, I guess.
Sounds like the Pentagon.
Yeah, I think it's obviously made up, but just the fact that he's just like peppering in these things in the background that I didn't even really notice, but now I'm really looking for things in the background that are questionable, or just, why would he put that there? And you know that Kubrick does have a hand on all that stuff, that type of set dressing. But yeah, I don't know. My theory is still forming, but I have not heard anybody come up with that theory before, but it makes a lot of sense. I know that other movies use kind of like mirroring, or kind of like you reap what you sow, but they haven't been this as direct as what I've seen in this movie.
But isn't that what they teach you in English class on how to write a paper? You state your premise, you give examples of your premise, and then at the end, your last paragraph is just restating your premise.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're restating what your hypothesis, or whatever you want to call it, your premise, your idea. Then
Yeah.
you give examples of it in the middle paragraph and then at the end. So it is a literary technique. So I'm sure that it's a film technique too, but you're right. That does match up. I'm actually surprised no one's pointed that out before because it seems when you started saying it, with all due respect to your brilliance, it seems
It
obvious,
does.
but it does seem obvious, but it's probably one of those things that seems so obvious that Kubrick is probably rolling around somewhere in heaven going, they still haven't picked up on that. People are talking about this movie and they're still not picked up on that. I have no way of knowing what he would think, but it would probably be sad to him that nobody's picked up on it yet. Now he's upstairs doing his little jig because Josh Knapp has figured it out. But it makes what you're saying makes perfect sense. I mean, structurally speaking, it makes sense because
Why would he?
the
Yeah,
last third of the
yeah. Why would he
yeah,
do all these things over again if not to make it in that structure?
and also even if that structure for you calling it the mirror of the center of itself, even if that part's not purposeful, there are definite themes in there like be careful what you wish for, be careful how you treat somebody because it's going to turn around on you. And I don't know if it's ironic that part of his the two worst part of his gang, if you will, if there is a worst, because Dim is not a good guy and he's
Mm,
not smart either. They become cops. It's
yeah.
definitely a statement about society and what we treat. And there's the authoritarianism, if you will. It definitely reoccurs because you're exactly right. They do go into the water and then because they do drag him through the forest for a period
Yep.
of time. And you're thinking, where are they taking him to? I remember where they were taking him,
Hmm.
but what's the chances that a bathtub or whatever that is, it's probably a trough for
Hmm.
animals. I don't know what it's doing in the middle of the woods there, but you're right because that's exactly what happens. Oh, that's interesting. It's interesting. It adds up.
Yeah. It does.
It definitely adds up.
Another thing I noticed is that when he's in the bathtub and starting to singing in the rain, every time I watch this movie, I've like keyed in on him singing in the rain, and waiting for the writer in the wheelchair to recognize it. But I knew that he wasn't going to recognize it until he kind of like got off the phone and wheeled around. So this time I actually listened to the phone conversation he was having, and I didn't realize that he doesn't understand that Malcolm McDowell, that the Alex character is the guy who actually attacked him and his wife. But and there's a little bit of voiceover where Alex says like, "Oh well, I was wearing a mask. He's not going to know it anyway." But he was like super excited, and then I realized this time, while he's on the phone, is that the reason why he's excited is that he's like the opposition writer, like he's for the party that's not in power, and he's so excited that he's going to be able to manipulate this person. So he is immediately going towards taking advantage of this young person who's obviously hurting and obviously had a traumatic experience, but he moves straight towards taking advantage of him for political gains. And only until he realizes that this person who he was going to utilize as a tool is now the person who killed his wife essentially and crippled him, that's when he decides to be more malicious with the guy. And also he talks about in his conversation, he says that Alex is the most potent weapon imaginable, the thin end of the wedge. Before long, we will have the full apparatus of totalitarianism, meaning that like this is the first example of mind control. And so he wants to use him as an example and make him do something horrendous or even make him kill himself, I guess, so that they can take that out. And essentially, he somewhat succeeds, but not really. I mean, he kind of sacrifices himself, I guess, because from what it sounds like, the minister who was in charge of all this stuff has jailed him. But you didn't think he was overacting, Patrick McGee?
I see why it's interesting because I wish I had said he's going to bring this up, he's going to bring this up, and he's going to ask me if I think that guy's overacting because I did think you were going to ask me that. While I was watching it,
Wine.
uh, see, I think that could only be answered if he did that in a film that wasn't stylized as much as this film is stylized, and that
Okay.
the themes are stylized and the acting is stylized and the language is stylized and the production design is stylized. It all is heightened above reality. So I would have to say then if that was overacting, then everything Dim does is overacting.
Mm.
Everything that the singing in the rain scene is overacting.
Mm.
So old lady at the health, the one that he ends up killing, that's
Oh,
overacting.
wow. Yeah.
I don't think so because the film is about a world that doesn't exist that we're never going to be able to visit. Thank God.
Yeah.
But if it wasn't heightened in the way that it was, I mean, okay, so is his bodyguard's body and gym shorts overacting? Because what the hell is the deal with that guy?
Yeah. Do you know who that is?
No,
That's David Prowse, who played Darth Vader. Now, he didn't voice Darth Vader, but he played Darth Vader.
it's a small world after all.
Yep. Because he's just,
Wow.
I guess he's like the
Yeah.
only tall English dude. I don't know, but like he's just a tall English dude. And I mean, he's obviously a bodybuilder too, I guess. But I
Yeah.
don't know if, I mean, they needed someone who was physically imposing to play Darth Vader. And so that's how it happened. He did all the lines on set too, and thought that his voice was going to be, he thought he was going to overdub himself and thought he was going to be the voice of Darth Vader. But he only has a couple lines in this movie, but he has kind of like a higher pitched voice. And so when you've got him versus James Earl Jones, another Stanley Kubrick alum, you know, I would pick James Earl Jones every time, but I think he was a little bit sore for that.
Well, you can be a little bit sore and you can be taken back by it, but at the same time, once you hear James Earl Jones, you go, "Yeah, that's the right
Yeah.
choice." I mean, I've done that a million times. Where I mean, hardly ever actually. I lie. I wanted to be cast in a play, and then when I see who gets cast, I'm like, "Yeah, that's the right choice. That guy was great. That's exactly who should have played the part." I think it's only happened one time to me where I thought, I really wish it was me. I mean, that guy did good, but I think I would have done what I needed to do. Uh, but he got the part, so I can't really say anything. But it's so what in this film isn't stylized? So does it mean that it's okay to have a wig on a statue that gives out milk, but it's not okay to have the same color green pubic hair in the film? I mean, it's like, when are you going to draw that line? Doesn't Kubrick have the ability to have actors go over the top? George C. Scott.
But see, George C. Scott went over the top and it was funny. Was this guy supposed to be funny when he was like writhing and like salivating? Was it supposed to be funny? Because it did not seem funny to me. It seemed out of place.
Are you talking about the scene where he's like
Leaning over. You talked about the shot
the
earlier.
conversation on?
No. Where he's like leaning over.
No, I think that's I think it's I think it's traumatizing.
Okay.
No, it's not supposed to be. Yeah, I think it's I think it's the same shot as Danny in The Shining. I don't find anything humorous about it.
Okay.
I don't think it's overacting at all. I think that guy is having post-traumatic stress fit right in front of us,
Okay.
and I think it's traumatizing.
One other thing that I wanted to talk about was the lighting and specifically the use of bare bulbs and shadows in this movie. There's a lot more bare bulbs in the movie than I think that I've seen in other films, at least films that were made before this movie. And usually it doesn't seem like you would want bare bulbs because you need like a shade on a lamp or something like that. But there's multiple scenes where there's just a bare light in the scene, and that might maybe the only light that is lighting the scene, especially in the writer's house. There's kind of these 4 stanchions with big spherical bulbs or spherical lights in there. And even in his bathroom, there's a very similar light, just a singular one. When Alex is taking a bath, that's the only light in the whole room. And there's other instances when he breaks into the health farm and the woman is in there. She has just kind of these like 3 little lamps, table lamps, but it's just a bunch of bulbs, like really, really bright bulbs right next to her. And that's like all that's lighting the whole scene. Is really harsh. And I don't know if that's more of like a stylistic choice as far as like industrial design versus a bunch of like frilly covers for lights. I'm not really sure, but it's definitely a bold choice from a style standpoint, but it also informs how the film is shot and exposure and other lights. It seemed like instead of lighting a scene with a bunch of lights and not knowing where the light's coming from or not having any shadows, he uses shadows a lot in this film. And especially at the very beginning, he's got that one shot where the 4 droogs are coming down like under an overpass, and they're going to talk with
Mm.
the bum, and it's just a single light way off in the distance, just casting these huge long shadows, and it's ominous. And similarly, at the end of the film, or close to the end of the film, when he goes through his display, we talked about it, him on the stage and having to lick the boot and having a woman come out and tempt him. There's a single spotlight on him, and we get a reverse shot of kind of looking out onto the crowd and of him. It's not a traditional shot, at least it wasn't a traditional shot back then. I know we've seen it in like Black Swan and a couple other films where you're kind of looking out against that singular light, but it's a bold choice, and it's not a traditional choice, especially when it comes to lighting. My guess is that the director of photography is probably like wanting to choke him, but I don't know if that was him trying to be futuristic or him trying to push boundaries or something, but it was something that I really noticed this time.
I of course noticed it. And did you notice that the lighting in the writer's house, the ones that you were talking about, the big white bulb ones, they also reflected on the table to make it look like there was double light there.
Ah,
Uh, when you
very
see his
cool.
buddy who comes in, yeah, intensely cool. So I don't know what the reasoning is that, but ever since Eyes Wide Shut, I've noticed his use of light bulbs, because his use of Christmas tree lighting in that film
Mm,
is really unusual. It's an unusual, whatever the cinematographer did. I mean, they might be the lights, but it's the same kind of lights on almost all Christmas trees in that movie. All the Christmas trees are colored, not white. And you would think when you have a doctor going to a sophisticated party that they would be these pristine all white lights and not these colored lights, because one is considered more sophisticated, I guess. I don't know. That's what I understand. I like all colored lights. I like all white lights. I like Christmas lights. I like Christmas. But they're unnerving the way that they're shot. And in that particular party scene, there are these big, like, star like Christmas decorations on the wall, and they have those same colored bulbs in them, and they're just big, huge light bulbs. I don't even think they're like Christmas bulbs. I think they're just
full size
big
bulbs.
bulbs. Yeah, and I was struck by how unnerved I was by that colorization that he uses.
Mm.
And so ever since then, I have noticed that he has, because isn't Barry Lyndon all shot with as much natural lighting as they
Yeah,
could?
they use candlelight. In fact, he got special lenses
Yeah.
made for him so that he could use film and use those candles and get enough light into the camera to expose the film properly. So yeah, I mean, he was really big on natural lighting, especially in Barry Lyndon, and maybe he's kind of like trying stuff out in A Clockwork Orange that he ends up using in Barry Lyndon. I don't know.
I know that lighting is extremely important. I've been in rehearsal and we've been doing a scene, and then you stand back and you watch another person do their scene and so forth and so on. And I've been standing in the theater as they're doing their tech rehearsal with lighting, and that comes closer to the end of the rehearsal process, and they have all these technical rehearsals where they try to get the spotlights in the right places and all the lights in the right places, the colors and the whatever, the gels, and then they run the show with lighting cues and all that other stuff. And I have been standing in the back of the theater and I've been watching a scene I've been watching for 6 weeks being rehearsed, and the lighting cue comes up and the scene is completely magical all of a sudden.
Mm.
And it just takes on a whole nother dimension with the spotlight coming from behind the stage. But I have noticed that, everybody knows I'm a big U2 fan, and they're a huge mainstream band according to the world and according to the reputation that they have. But they do these really strange things with their lighting that maybe after being a fan of theirs for 30 some odd years, I've noticed. And I don't know if people notice it or if it's meant to be noticed, but all of their lighting is asymmetrical, meaning it's never even. They had these big cylinder looking, like, I don't even know how to describe them. They used the LED rope lighting and made these cylinder lights that hung from the stage before the show started. And one was kind of center, and then one was about 10 feet behind it, almost at an angle. And then the other one was higher and pushed back all the way to the right hand side. And there was nothing even about it. And I thought that's strange, but that unevenness of it gave it a texture that if you had just put them symmetrical, it wouldn't have given the same exact
Hmm.
thing. So, and they all, for being one of the biggest bands in the world, you would think that they would do the opposite of this. But whenever they do a DVD, or really a lot of their concert lighting is backlighting, huge like flood lighting coming from behind them, which
Mm.
is a great effect live, but it shouldn't be your prominent way to light one of the biggest bands in the world. I mean,
Yeah.
Bono has a big enough ego. Maybe he doesn't need a spotlight, which they do have. But
Well,
I
s-
find that interesting when they do something like With or Without You, which is a huge hit for them, that instead of it being this big spectacle, it becomes this kind of intimate song that nobody's ever heard before because there's these huge, like aqua blue faded floodlights behind them
mhm.
that look like they're too old for the technology of the day.
but
But yet that's what they went with.
But
So it's interesting.
silhouettes are powerful though. I mean, a silhouette, it leaves a lot to your imagination as far as like what is inside that silhouette. So I can see why they would use that. And there's speaking of silhouettes and of crazy lighting in Clockwork Orange, in that one scene where there was just that one spotlight on the woman, especially when she gets done with her scene, when he kind of tries to reach up and all that stuff. She gets done with her scene. It was so hilarious. First of all, they clap, and I think it's just a bunch of guys in a room clapping for a naked woman, which is okay, fine. But at the same time, she like completely turns on a dime from like, I'm this thing you can't have, I'm very sensuous, to like, oh, thank you, I'm a good actress, please call me at my number and I'm gonna wave at you. Okay, thank you, goodbye. Like she just like completely like changes her demeanor on a dime, and she turns into this like actress that loves this applause. She's like, this is why I do it. This is why I get up in the morning. And it's just like, you are just being used, lady. It seemed so grimy, but also hilarious.
Yeah, there's a little pep in her step as she turns around after she takes her final bow.
Yes.
She does this little peppy, like, oh, I'm off.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bunch of scientists that are watching it. It's so inappropriate that they're clapping.
Are they clapping that he didn't attack her? Or are they clapping that, like, hey, we
Yeah.
got to see a naked woman? Or are they like, she thinks they're clapping for her, which I think is also funny. But I mean, maybe they are, but they're not clapping because she was such a good actress.
No, they're not.
But she
No,
thinks it,
you're
though.
right. You're absolutely right. And she is symmetrically correct all the way over her body, by the way. I'm trying not to be a pig about it. I don't want to.
Objectify?
Yes, thank you.
You don't want to do what those guys in that room did to her?
Exactly. She's a beautiful
Yeah.
woman. But yeah, they're not clapping because she did such a great job. And scene, it wasn't like
I know.
that.
Oh my
It
gosh.
wasn't like
That
yeah.
was pretty funny. I was like,
Yeah.
oh man, I'm sure that Paul would love that, because you've probably like,
Well, the fact that yeah, I've seen it a million times. The fact that it's played like that is hilarious because that is exactly something I would do. I would be in some kind of like technical production and I would turn and I would be like, voila, ta-da. Yeah, I would totally do
wow.
it. Probably get fired too.
Okay. Well, so I did have a question about the end. So what do you think happens to him at the end of the movie? After the end of the movie?
I don't know if it's not the type of thing where I wonder what's going to happen to them. Like I wonder what's happening to Stu Redman and Franny at the end of The Stand. It's not like that. I don't wonder about this character and what his next steps in life are. I just think to myself once again, who's being manipulated, who's doing the manipulation, is is the organization that's released his demons again, are they at fault? Is he at fault because of society? I don't think necessarily what happens to the characters important. I think the fact that he has gone back to being who he was at the beginning of the film, because I take it somehow whatever they do they trigger that again.
Yeah, his fall, I think kind of like cured, quote unquote, cured him.
Yeah. So I think it's more about where you fall in life on that Richter scale. Meaning, are you willing to accept that you're a flawed human being and you need to improve and you need to work on that and things are going to bring you back and things are going to allow, and that's a simple way to look at it, but that's how I have to look at it because I don't want to know what happens to him after the film. I'm done. I got 2 hours and 15 minutes of you, dude, and
Yeah.
I'm cool. I'm done.
Yeah. Well,
So that's not important. I think the idea of what has happened to him is more important for me.
Mm. I think, yeah, I think that by the end of the film, for me at least, what I get from it is that the government has tried and failed to change the mind of this man. And the only thing that can change him is himself and his interactions with society. And we see a glimpse of a potential of hope where when he's been kicked out of his family's house and he comes across the bum from the beginning of the film, and he doesn't recognize the bum and the bum doesn't recognize him, and he gives the bum his change, and then the bum realizes who he is, and then they beat him up. But in that moment, that's the only kind of like glimmer of hope that we have of like, and that's also before he, falls out the window and all that stuff. So I don't know where he's at, but at the time, at the very end of the film, he's obviously getting ready to go out and do exactly what he did at the beginning of the film. But maybe there's a way for him to grow up, and that's essentially what the last chapter of Burgess's book is that he has grown up. There is hope, but in this movie, the only hope we can pull is the hope that we would have for any human being. I guess I don't know. But the big fact is that the government tried and failed to forcefully change a human's demeanor and being. You could say it's against his will, but they kind of tried to take the thought and emotion. They tried to take the person out of the person and just make him, well, like what the title is, A Clockwork Orange. They tried to make him just kind of an automaton that goes through and only has the choice to do good things and never has to choose to either do a good thing or a bad thing. He always does the good thing, because if he tries to do the bad thing or if he even thinks about the bad thing, then he gets revolted. So they're lobotomizing him. They're trying to lobotomize him.
No, it's not that I don't disagree. I hear what you're saying, and I think your analysis is correct. But I don't know. I find myself funny that I would even say something like this. If he like broke up with some girl because he was sleeping with another girl, and he decided to sleep with her boyfriend instead, and didn't have any care about you shouldn't be like cheating on people and lying to people and doing things that you shouldn't be doing because you're messing with people's hearts, then that's one thing. Then if they were trying to change him at the age of 15, 16, 17, however old he wants to be, the book or the movie version of his age, that's one thing. Then you're changing a learning experience. You can't cheat on somebody and expect good results. You can't lie to somebody and expect good results, but you have to go through those things where you think because you're 15, 16 and you're beautiful that you can sleep with anybody that you want and not worry about the consequences. You have to go through that in order to understand that there are consequences, because when you fall in love with that guy that you cheated on that girl with and he breaks your heart, then you learn and you grow. And that's a learning experience as a young adult. And you have to go through those experiences. So if somebody was to rip him away from that experience and try to change him from doing something like that, that would be trying to change the core essence of who he is as a human being at the age of 15, 16, 17, and how he might be in his 20s or 30s because he didn't have the experience to grow. And without the heartbreak and without falling in love with somebody you weren't expecting to fall in love with, you're never going to grow in that scenario. When you're talking about rape, murder, violence, for any other reason, not that there is a reason for it, but, scorned lovers, that's not a reason for killing somebody, but it's a reason why it happens, is a little bit, not to justify murder's murder, but you can't kill somebody. Thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say unless they cheated on you. It says thou shalt not kill. So he's out there mindlessly creating violence in people's worlds and traumatizing those people for the rest of their life because that's what he gets a kick out of. So if somebody could be changed from a sociopath into a human being, regardless of the technique and why, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing per se.
Just as long as it's not you.
Yeah, but I'm not out there killing and raping people, and I'm not a menace to society.
Yeah.
I'm making bad choices because I'm a human being and I'm dumb. And I thought he was really cute instead of her. That's the reason why I'm doing something that I'm doing,
Yeah.
not because I get a kick out of being violent.
Yeah. I see what you're saying, but I think that there's some line that gets crossed when you give the government power to physically change someone's mind or someone's being. And we can try to manipulate and try to modify behaviors on a micro level all we want, but at some point, that power that you give that person or that government entity or that minister or whatever, they're only going to want more power. So if they have the ability to take someone like Alex, who's just the detritus of society, and someone who just needs to not interact with any human being because everyone they've interacted with, they've done wrong to at the very least and killed at the very most, then we now are giving license to someone to now change someone. Like there's an inherent sense of individuality and liberty that we each feel, at least in the country that I live in, and in England at the time too. And I think that's what Burgess and Kubrick are kind of going for, is to say that you can't, you can't allow a system, you can't allow the government to control other people's minds. I mean, that's literally what they're doing. They're controlling his mind. They're not allowing him to think certain things, and that is essentially a lobotomy. And so, I mean, there's other films about that. There's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and all those things, and we don't have to figure it out tonight. But I do think that that's what both Kubrick and Burgess were going for. And I would tend to lean towards them. There's you could lobotomize everyone who is a rapist, and then that might not be good enough because somebody else might get raped, and then you're gonna try to lobotomize everyone who could be a rapist, and then what'll end up happening is sometime down the line there'll be very few people who aren't lobotomized. It may not happen now, it may not happen in 10 years, it may not happen in 50 years, but it may happen. So that's kind of, I think, where they're coming from.
I get what you're saying. So you're saying free will has a cost.
Yeah.
So if you're a pedophile, you have the free will to be a pedophile, because that, no matter how you look at it, regardless, and everybody knows that that's just wrong.
Yeah.
On so many levels, it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You can't justify it on any level for any reason at all. But you're saying it's a slippery slope, that if you were to lobotomize pedophiles, then what if somebody didn't know they were a pedophile and then they became a pedophile? Then you're saying you would lobotomize everybody with the potential to be a pedophile.
What if there's a pre-pedophile gene that we determine? And so, like, these 20 people have this pre-pedophile gene. We need to, lobotomize them so that they don't ever get into a situation where they're with a child and they could potentially do something to that child because they have the pre-pedophile gene. There's so many possibilities. You could just go on and on and on. Once you let that horse out of the barn, you can't get them back in.
So the free will has a cost.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with you. I completely understand what you're saying. I get it. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
It's just hard pressed to believe that you can't do things that could make society better, because overall it's not good for society, because the implications are,
the short-term gains are huge. And I think that's what the government is in this film. That's what the government's looking at. Crime is horrible. What do we do? Okay, so we get certain people off the street. The thugs, and they even said that in the phone call. The writer is talking to whoever they're talking to. He even says that. He's like, yeah, one of their policies is to take the thugs and make them into police officers, because they're going to beat people up anyway. Why not beat people up as police officers and be part of the system, instead of beating people up separate from the system and then having police officers have to go after them?
Well, this is a whole nother conversation we can have it the next time we talk about A Clockwork Orange, and maybe we'll do it once a year, because there's too many things. You're right. There's too many things to talk about, because when you said, do you have anything else? I'm like, yeah, 3 more podcasts about talking about A Clockwork Orange, because there's too much. The question could be posed at the end of the film. What's worse? The party in power of the government that thinks it's okay to use this aversion therapy, or the party that wants to be in power who uses Malcolm McDowell's character against the party? Yeah, I see. Yeah, I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't thinking Big Brother.
There you go.
I was thinking.
You're thinking about saving people. I get it. I understand. Yes, I also want to save people.
Yeah. Well, I also believe that people make bad choices at certain points in their life, and that's how they grow.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that there are bad choices that have consequences, and depending on your bad choice and what your intentions are, can further you as a human being, or it can stop you as a human being. Yeah. And I think that Alex has been proven to just be a sociopath,
Yeah.
and just not care one way or another. That his gratification, whatever it very well may be, which is ultimately
Yeah.
violent, no matter what his gratification is, then that person, you alter that person. But I get what you're saying, because it's a slippery slope.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, you don't alter that person. You have to keep that person away from society, and that's really sad. But there's certain things you have to do, and there's certain things I think that you just can't do from a moral standpoint. But anyway, okay, all right. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about this film again. I'm sure it's come up in the past in our podcasts, but I'm glad that we kind of did a really deep dive on A Clockwork Orange. So, all right, you can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. You go to facebook.com/actorengineer. You can tweet us at actorengineer. And if you want to find our podcasts on YouTube, you can just go to YouTube and search for Actor and Engineer Podcast. We'll see you next time.